Hi, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. Welcome to our Week in Review. A number of things happened this week that I think were revealing, to put it mildly. Let's talk domestic policy first. We escaped another shutdown because the House Democrats are essentially running the show. That's right. They don't have the majority, but without them, the Speaker of the House couldn't accomplish what he ostensibly wanted, which was to keep the government operating. So you have a weird situation now where, although they didn't put him there, they are free and absolutely willing to criticize him and to take him to account for his extreme Christian nationalist view. Democrats are essentially running the House for him. They are keeping the government operating because he can't manage a majority that would do it, just as the former Speaker McCarthy, couldn't avoid a debt crisis without the Democrats. So understand this has happened 3 times now, on the debt, on the extension of the operating budget, and again this week. So we have a peculiar situation where Democrats are essentially in control of a body in which they are the minority. But this is what happens when the Republican Party loses all functionality. They don't have the majority because only about 120 or so of them are interested in governing at all. And that was roughly the number that voted to extend the budget, to extend the continuing resolution. And because of that, Democrats essentially hold all the cards. What we found out this week is Johnson doesn't have a desire to shut down the government, but he doesn't have the votes. So that makes him dependent upon Democrats. And that raises an interesting possibility. What could they get from this guy? Well, I had hoped this time around they would have cajoled him into using the continuing resolution to also pass through aid to Israel, aid to Ukraine, aid to Taiwan. They didn't do it this time, but they sure as heck should do it in the meantime. The Senate, I think, is going to send over a bill that combines all of the aid packages. The Senate Republicans, at least some of them, and most importantly, Mitch McConnell, do not want to leave Ukraine to the Russian bear. They understand the necessity of funding all 3 allies, which face different but equally vicious threats from totalitarian or barbaric groups, as the case may be. So that's going to come on over. What happens then? Democrats, I think, should start playing their cards. They should force a vote on the House floor using, if they need be, a motion to discharge, and then force an up or down vote on all 3 of these aid packages, these aid amounts. And in that way, I think they present Republicans with a choice. Are you really in favor of American strength in the world? Are you really in favor of Israel? Are you really in favor of Ukraine? Or is all this just posturing? Now, it's interesting that the very same week that Johnson was putting this continuing resolution on the floor, without aid to Israel, he had the nerve to show up at the March for Israel on the Mall in Washington, D.C., depending upon who you talk to, 200 or 290,000 people, and proclaim that he was strong for Israel. Well, in that case, where was the aid? It wasn't in the continuing resolution, just like Ukraine wasn't in there. So I think there's some room to maneuver here. And Democrats, although they don't have the majority, can sure start acting like one and advancing their own agenda and their own conditions. And although I don't have any great hopes for anything beyond that for 2024, I think we'll just limp forward to the election next year. I think the Democrats deserve to take a victory lap. Now, they're very bad at this. Democrats don't like to accept success. They're so busy finding fault with one another, they can't do this naturally. But they really should, considering that what they have accomplished without the House majority is to protect in its entirety the 2 years of the Biden agenda. Not one penny has been rolled back from infrastructure, from chips, from the Inflation Reduction Act. That's an accomplishment considering they don't control the House, not really. They have also, at least for now, been able to keep up our international obligations. And that's no small feat considering one party is dedicated to chaos, destruction, nihilism. So they should pat themselves on the back, but then get the job done by getting our foreign policy affairs in order. So let's talk a little bit about that March for Israel. I was on the mall, and it was extraordinary in lots of different ways. One, the old adage that if there are 10 Jews, there are 1,000 opinions. Well, here there were 200,000 or so Jews, and essentially 3 opinions that everyone agreed on. One, that anti-Semitism is abhorrent and has gotten out of hand, largely because people who should be in charge are not acting as grown, mature adults, pointing the finger directly at college campuses, which I thought was a healthy corrective course. Secondly, that the hostages must come home. We have put all of this pressure, public press, on Israel for a ceasefire. Where is the pressure to bring the hostages home? This war would end tomorrow if the Hamas terrorists threw up their arms, surrendered, and gave back the hostages. Someone said, well, we would stop the killing if Israel declared a ceasefire. There was a ceasefire on October 6th, and we saw what would happen. You don't get peace until you dismantle the terrorist organization and get these people back. And that was very clear as well. And I think the third message of this march is simply that there is bipartisan, near universal support for the notion, at least in the Jewish community, perhaps not necessarily in all quarters, that Israel has a fundamental right to exist. And once you accept that, once you really accept that, the notion of a ceasefire is preposterous. You cannot simultaneously say you have the right to exist, you have the right to have a homeland, but you cannot destroy an existential threat. You have to leave them still ready to attack at a moment's notice. So I think those messages really resonated with the crowd. It was uplifting. It was positive. There was no hatred. There was no calls to eliminate any people. There was no chants like you've seen at the Palestinian rallies. And I should say those really aren't Palestinian rallies. Those have been essentially pro-Hamas propaganda shows. But it was uplifting. It was a relief. It was reinforcing for Jews who have felt so victimized, so isolated, so betrayed by many on the left, in this case, in other cases on the right, that I think it was really restorative. And I was surprised to see people, Jews in Cleveland, stand with Israel, Jews from Houston stand with Israel, and they all had signs pointing out the geographic disparity. And it was also interesting to see really how diverse the Jewish community is. Everyone from the ultra-Orthodox schools, bust down from New York City, from Brooklyn, from other places, all the way to completely secularized Jews and Christians as well. So it was a good moment. It was a restorative moment. And it reminded me that what we see in the press is not necessarily representative of much of anything, that the entire American scene is much saner than I think you would have us believe, or the media would have us believe, simply by looking at what they cover and what's on the news. So let's now turn to the war itself. It's very interesting. This week, the Israelis finally made their way into the hospital in Gaza that has been the source of a lot of controversy. Now, remember, we have been hearing for weeks, for months, this is just a hospital. The Israelis are committing war crimes by assaulting it. This is just doctors and patients. Terrible, terrible, terrible. So what have the Israelis found? They have found massive numbers of weapons. They have found 2 bodies of hostages. We don't yet know whether they were assassinated before or after they were brought back to Gaza. And we have found an entrance to a tunnel with stairs going down. But the New York Times says this does not conclude the debate. Really? It doesn't? I think it does. I think it shows that this was being used for clearly non-medical purposes. And those people who have been telling us over and over again, it's a lie, there are no terrorists here, there's no military here, have either one, been lying, two, been forced to say this with a gun to their head, which I think is entirely possible, or three, been so bamboozled and confused by the terrorists that they don't know what's going on in their own backyard. But you'll notice now how the stakes and how the goalposts have been moved. Now Israel has to prove that this was a center of control, command and control. Really, why is that the standard for anything? It's a military objective. They are using human shields in violation of international law. Terrorists clearly were there. They recovered a computer and disks showing pictures, we don't know how many, of the hostages. What more need be said? And yet, of course, with Israel, there's a double, a triple standard. It's not good enough that you prove that there are weapons there. It's not good enough that you find two hostages there. It's not good enough that you find that there's a tunnel there. Now it has to be a complete command and control center. Who makes up these rules? These don't correspond to rules of war or anything else. And this is where I come back to how Israel probably is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. It cannot stop. It cannot declare a ceasefire without getting back every one of the hostages and without pretty much eviscerating the entire Hamas command and control structure, its ability to wage war. And President Biden, God bless him, said exactly that. After his meeting with President Xi of China, he was asked by a credulous reporter, well, when is it going to be enough? When will Israel be able to stop? As if Israel simply is extending this and risking its own people more than necessary. And Biden looked at the reporter almost pathetically and said, well, it's going to end when Hamas doesn't have the ability to go and murder Israelis and commit atrocities the way they did on October 7th. Perfect answer. That is the answer. They're going to stop when there is no longer an existential threat of horrendous crimes against humanity and the Jewish people and other Israelis. It's not just Jews who were brutalized, who were kidnapped, who were murdered. It was Druze, it was Arabs who live in Israel, and it was foreigners. So this notion that Israel just cares about Jews or it's Jews versus Hamas is false. It's humanity against Hamas. So the war goes on, and I think it will go on for some time. Meanwhile, the critics of Netanyahu, and I am one of them, have good company, and that is the Israeli people. When you look at the number of seats that they would get in the Knesset, there are 120, so 60 plus one, presumably, would be enough for a majority government. The number of seats that his party would control now is 16. That's right, 16, 1-6. So his support has completely collapsed because now the jig is up. The guy who promised that he would always protect the Jewish state, that he had to have this hardline policy, that he had to be outrageously tough with the Palestinians, well, he was simply a paper tiger, and he presided over the worst massacre in Jewish history since the Holocaust. So he's on his way out. He's going to go. He may not go during the war because, as one might imagine, it's a little bit disruptive to get rid of a prime minister during a war. But nevertheless, he will go. And when he goes, we in the West should be there to help the nascent pro-democracy, pro-judicial independence movement, pro-two-peace, two-state solution movement. Now, those things don't necessarily line up. There are many in the democracy movement who have great qualms about a two-state solution. But the United States and the rest of the world, needless to say, has to support a government that will replace the current regime, that is pro-democracy, that is rational, that does not make it as its policy to antagonize, demonize Palestinians, and does not include people who continue to use genocidal language, which then, of course, Israel's critics attribute to the country as a whole. So the war goes on. I will end with some good news. And of course, once again, you can't completely take credit for this because the press and the Democrats will never really take a victory laps. But the economy is great. We have been bringing down inflation. It's now at essentially a standstill from the month before, down to 3.2%. At the very time, we have enormous growth. Third quarter, we had 4.9%. At the time, we were still generating hundreds of thousands of jobs. This is a near miracle, but you would never know it because as soon as this happens, it disappears as an issue. You will notice that it's simply assumed that, oh, okay, the economy's recovered. Next issue. Let's go back to the issues, which are apparently Biden's age and senility, neither of which should be an issue. So we can be, I think, pleased that this combination of fiscal stimulus and investment that Biden put forward, which was Bidenomics, and his support for the Federal Reserve, which gradually raised interest rates, seems to have achieved the near impossible, which is the soft landing. And in comparison to the rest of the world, the United States is miles ahead, lower inflation, bigger growth, much stronger job production. So on the week before Thanksgiving, we can say we have every reason to be thankful. Thank God Biden is in control and not the former president. Thank goodness we have criminal cases that are proceeding against the former guy. Thank goodness we have Democrats in the House who can govern and govern rationally, reasonably. Thank God we have an American voting electorate that rejected Republicans in Virginia, for example, and voted once again for a pro-choice motion, this time in Ohio. So there's a lot to be thankful for. We have problems. We have threats. Donald Trump has taken the mask off. He's gone full Nazi. He's gone full fascist, talking about rounding people up, talking about vermin, talking about polluting the blood. He is a menace. He's a disgrace. But I have never felt at this point more confident about our ability to beat him in 2024, to come through this both economically and internationally in fairly sound shape. And you should take some comfort as well. Rest up, enjoy your Thanksgiving, and get ready to come back and fight for the next year because it won't be easy, but I think it is doable. If you enjoyed this program, please tell your friends. They can follow this. They can follow our main program, which is Jen Rubin's Green Room, dropping a new episode every Wednesday. They can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever they get their podcasts. Bye-bye.